It's the DNP Project Podcast with your hosts, Dr. Molly Bradshaw and Dr. Tracy Vitale.
Episode 3, the minimum DNP project elements. In this episode, we are going to review the recommendations from the American Association of Colleges of Nursing, or the AACN, on minimum expectations of a DNP project.
So welcome to the DNP Project Podcast, where we share tips, inspiration, and more. My name is Dr. Molly Bradshaw, and I'm one of the co-hosts of the show. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Tracy Vitale. Hi, Tracy.
Hi, Molly.
In today's episode, as you said before, we're going to talk about the AACN and the minimum recommendations that they have for a DNP project. So for our audience, a little bit of history here. In 2015, there was a white paper that was written to kind of clarify some of the issues surrounding the DNP project. Essentially, there was just a feeling, and more than a feeling, a reality that there's some inconsistency about the expectations of projects, what should be included, what shouldn't, what should count, what should not count. So they wrote this paper to help clarify some of those issues, and that is freely available online, and we encourage everyone to go and read that document for yourself. But some of the key points, some other things they tried to clarify in this document is language and terminology. For example, we want to use the term DNP project instead of capstone or instead of capstone project, because people do capstone projects at other levels of nursing, at the BSN or the MSN level. So we want to really distinguish the DNP project. So one of their recommendations in that paper was to use the term DNP project rather than capstone project. Another example is in order to distinguish the DNP from the PhD, we want to use the term DNP team rather than DNP committee. PhD candidates have a committee. We want to distinguish the DNP by using the term DNP team. So just some things like that. There's a lot of clarification that this paper offers. Another clarifying idea in the paper is that a DNP project must implement something. You have to do something. You have to take some type of action. It's not enough to just recommend or say that we should do this. We're about making practice change and evaluating the outcomes. We talked about that a lot on the previous episode. So in this paper, this is really the source of where we come together on the idea that we want students to be able to implement something. There is some clarifications in that paper about group projects. Essentially, it says that in group projects, students have to be responsible individually for a deliverable. They have to be evaluated individually, because we don't want the group project to be something like, oh, you're good at talking and I'm good at writing, so I'll just do this while you do that. Part of doing the DNP project is to ensure that each student has a skill set in each of these elements. So we really have to be sure that we're setting group projects up in ways that have rules and guidelines that each student is being evaluated. And there's more about that in our workbook if people need more clarification on that. But one of the other real key things in the very beginning of that document is there was a list that says basically all DNP projects at minimum should do X, Y, and Z. So what I want to talk about next is, can you start to guide us through, Tracy, what those minimum expectations are, and let's break them down and talk about them one at a time.
Sure. So the first, and again, these are directly from the AACN white paper, so check that out. The first point is that all projects should focus on a change that impacts healthcare outcomes either through direct or indirect care.
So can you give us an example of what direct or indirect might look like?
Sure. So I think most projects tend to take on the direct care approach. I think that it's a little bit easier for students to conceptualize that. So this might include a project that implements a specific screening tool in a practice setting, for example. Maybe it's the implementation of the PH2 Q9 among a certain population. Maybe it's implementation of the Edinburgh scale in a pediatric setting to evaluate for postpartum depression and evaluate the impact of healthcare outcomes, whether it be referral to services or management of patients based on the outcome of implementing that screening tool.
Mm-hmm. And so likewise, can you give us an example of what an indirect outcome might look like?
An indirect outcome might be, this is something that maybe a nursing leadership student in a DNP program might look at. They may be focusing their outcomes on the financial results of certain business practices. There was a student that recently I attended her presentation where she looked at the use of a tracking board in their ICU setting and basically did some cost analysis of the use of that board and the effectiveness of the staffing and the workflow processes. So it had a very nursing leadership business aspect of their approach to their design, but ultimately what it was really all about was improving the care of the patients.
Mm-hmm. Because the better the workflow, the better the fiscal outcomes, patients in turn benefit from that, or populations benefit from that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what does it mean when a project has a systems or population aggregate focus? What's that one all about?
So when we think about it, when we think about projects, we want to be thinking about who's the focus of the project. Is it a very small population of folks? Is it a specific subset of maybe a certain group of patients with a specific diagnosis? Or are we looking on a more population-based setting? Is it folks that are, living in an urban setting, or are we really narrowing that down into a specific ethnicity or cultural component of people within that subset?
Mm-hmm. And I would just add to that, I agree. The systems aspect, I think that we all have to appreciate that healthcare does not occur in a bubble. There are factors at many levels that are affecting care and affecting the patients, affecting the population. So it's got to be considerate of those different levels of systems and where those patients and populations are existing in those systems.
Absolutely.
And we've harped about this quite a lot, but one of the minimum expectations AACN outlines is the requirement for implementation. Talk to us about that.
So basically, we want you to do something. Again, we've talked about how in the past, prior to the white paper coming out, there were some projects that were approved because at the time there wasn't that guidance that was provided, where it was a great project, but it didn't necessarily impact outcomes the way that we would hope someone with a practice degree would be, is best utilized. So when we think about systematic reviews or integrative reviews, that review of the literature is extremely valuable, but we want you to be able to do something with it. So that way there's an opportunity to truly change practice. So I think what's interesting with these guidelines is that they do provide some clear direction, but there's still room for interpretation. It says there, you have to demonstrate implementation, but it doesn't necessarily say where in the process it needs to happen. Implementation might be the first thing you do, or it might be the last thing you do, based on an evaluation of the process. And we see that in examples that do a systematic review. Some will argue that the rigorous process of a systematic review is the evaluation. and then they're taking that information and implementing it into some other form. But the key bottom line, you have to do something in some capacity as a minimum requirement for the project.
Mhm. And that leads nicely into the next element, which is if you do something, it's got to be sustainable. It can't just be a one-off, one and done, or I shouldn't say can't, but the goal, the idea, the best case scenario is that we want it to be something that lives and continues beyond the DNP project if we want practice change to be meaningful, right?
Right. Absolutely. You know, I always tell students when we think about sustainability, it's not about you. It's not about you, the student. It's about the project. How does the project continue?
That's a great point.
You know, I think about the amount of time that I spent on my own DNP project and you spent on your project. That's a lot of time and effort invested by a lot of different people for that project to have been carried through. And I think the last thing any of us want is it to have just ended once I finished, or once, you know, you finish or the students finish. Where do we go from here? And, you know, we have taken this recommendation of including a plan for sustainability to really allow the students to be the creative ones and think about, what does the next DNP project look like? How can we take the work of one student and set up the next student to build upon that and create another project off of it, whether it's an expansion of the existing project, is in the same setting, is it, you know, doing a project with the Girl Scouts and translating that into seeing if it is something that would work in a different population like the Boy Scouts, you know, and thinking about where we go from here. I think what's also important to think about when we think about sustainability is to think about, you know, the financial implications, thinking about, you know, political or health policy implications of this, and maybe something that took place in a organizational setting, how can that potentially translate into some political activity that might take on the constructs of a health policy type DNP project.
Right. And in our previous episode, we talked about an evaluation. You know, this is one of the most important parts to me, maybe perhaps second only to implementation, is that we have to evaluate. You know, we said in the other episode, you've got to implement, you've got to evaluate, and you have to evaluate the process and the outcomes. It's both. Talk to us about your perspective on that.
Right. So it's interesting because a lot of folks think solely about the outcomes. I was intending to evaluate the referral rates on, you know, for mental health services based on a certain screening tool, and here are the results. Those results, those outcomes are important, but so is an appreciation for the process. What worked well? What didn't? What were facilitators? What were barriers in implementing that process? Because, you know, your outcomes, when someone's reading your paper or reading a manuscript, you know, we have learned to always look at the limitations of that project or of that study, to kind of paint the picture of why you might have gotten the results that you've gotten. So that reflection on the process is also important, because that might have contributed significantly to why you have those results. You know, at the time of us recording this, we're living in the middle of the COVID pandemic. I think we've got some students that are going to be impacted by that event, but, you know, by this, what's currently happening is certainly going to impact the outcomes and the process of implementing their project. So being able to reflect on that and include that as part of the project is critically important, whether it's formative or summative, so that way everybody can appreciate the results that are being reported.
And I'm just sitting here thinking, as you're talking to that, one of the things that comes to mind for me is evaluating process is an opportunity for feedback, right? So if we're going to improve practice, we have to continuously be collecting feedback. And part of feedback is learning to design questions that get the feedback that you're looking for. So although I know survey research has some very strict rules about how you write survey questions and put that together, but there is, I believe, a fundamental importance for a DNP student to have an ability to design a simple survey for the purpose of feedback and for the purpose of process evaluation. I think that's a real integral skill that we need to emphasize. The other thing that I would say to that is that evaluating process is an opportunity to look more at qualitative data. It's what was that experience like for you? How could we make it better? It's very simple, but a lot of our outcomes data, I would argue, is a little heavier to the quantitative side of the house most of the time. You know, it's fiscal, it's a score, it's that type thing. So if we want students to have the best learning experience, one of the ways that we can incorporate that is to teach them how to elicit, document, and analyze feedback, perhaps through a survey, perhaps through a focus group, perhaps through interviews, to really develop their qualitative skill set. And then on the quantitative side, we've got the more traditional outcomes things that we're looking at, like benchmarking or scores and tools and instruments and things that are a little bit more, well, just it's quantitative in nature. So that's, as an educator, sort of the way that I think about that is, if you put both things together, it's really giving a student the best skill set to serve them in the real world. So
absolutely. And I think that that process evaluation is so important to the bigger picture of trying to change practice and change outcomes. You know, if it didn't work, why not? A lot of times when students are presenting their final project, I ask them, you know, what would you have done differently? Or what do you see as were the barriers in being able to conduct your project, regardless of the results that they have? And oftentimes they're able to very easily come up with answers to that question as to how they would have done it differently. And if they had to do it again, here's how they would have done it. Whether it's based on their own self-reflection or based on feedback from the participants that were asked to be a part of that process.
And so the next minimum recommendation basically says that clinical significance is an important part of guiding practice, and that projects really should be designed in a way that we're looking at using the outcomes to guide practice and policy. So talk us through that element.
Yeah, so I think, you know, sometimes when I there's a difference between clinical significance from statistical significance. As someone who, when I conducted my project, did not find statistical significance, that was upsetting to me. In fact, I wasn't sure if I was going to graduate. I thought it meant that I had a bad project, and it's not. Your data is your data, and you know, that's it. But the question is it possible that there could have been some clinical significance? And I think each project, depending on its design, can certainly bring value to that and help stress the importance of the work that a student has done. If you've got a project where there was no clinical significance, but statistical significance, but based on your work and the efforts that you made out in the community or in your practice setting, you were able to identify patients that were eventually diagnosed with melanoma. I think you'd find some folks that would certainly argue the point that there's some clinical significance in that.
And I love the word value when you said value, I really try to emphasize that word with my students, because to me, in my mind, if one patient valued it, I can live with that. I can live with that. Or if one clinician, it made their work process easier, or, then there's value to that. So it's just important that we think about significance versus value and how we're using it to guide and shape our policy. So the last recommendation is that the project should be a foundation of future scholarship. So what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so, before, when we talked about a plan for sustainability, I had said this is about the project, right? That plan for sustainability is about the project. How does it keep going once the student has graduated? Providing a foundation for future practice scholarship is all about the student. This is when we say it's about you. How do you take what you've learned? How do you take this skill set and, having completed this project, and take that with you moving forward? How do you allow this to become the foundation of what you do moving forward? We often challenge students when they're vetting project ideas. One of the first questions I ask them is, what program are you in? I happen to teach at a facility that's got 13 different programs for them to choose from. So, they'll tell me, oh, I'm in the pediatric nurse practitioner program. Okay, that's great. And then I'll say, tell me about your project. What's the problem? And they may say, well, we are having some issues with patient satisfaction. So I work in labor and delivery, and I want to do a project on bedside report, because
that doesn't seem like it matches up.
It doesn't. Is bedside report important? Absolutely. Is patient satisfaction important? Absolutely. However, if you are enrolled in a pediatric nurse practitioner program, I'm going to challenge you and say, how is that going to impact you as a nurse practitioner? How is that going to be providing you with a skill set and a level of expertise necessary for, a good 6 to 18 months worth of intensive efforts in completing a project, going to guide you as on bedside report, going to guide you as a pediatric nurse practitioner. I want to see students focus their efforts on something that they're going to be able to take with them and say, listen, not only am I a pediatric nurse practitioner, but I did my project on pediatric asthma, and now all of a sudden you've been able to establish yourself as not only a PNP, but an expert in pediatric asthma, and allow you to build upon that moving forward as your career develops and you gain more and more experience in practice.
And just to add to that, so what I hear you say in that is, if you're in a BSN to DNP program, you are probably working in an RN role. And so when we ask you to identify problems, the mindset automatically goes to RN related problems, maybe not what your future role is going to look like as an NP. So that's something to consider for sure. And on the flip side of that, for maybe a nurse who already has the master's degree and is already practicing in the role that they're going to continue to be in, I think that choice of the scholarship of the DNP project moves you to an expert status. So those students, I'm always asking my postmaster students, what do you want to be the expert of? Because by the time you're done with this project, there should be no one that knows more about this than you do. You should be the expert. You should know everything that there is to know about it. And so how does that help promote you in your organization, move you to other leadership positions, that type of thing? So in my mind, the future practice scholarship, in both worlds, it really is about what do you want to be the expert of, and build a following and an expertise around that content. What do you want to be the expert of? So
I think that's absolutely right. And to that point, if you're going to become the expert in it, and it's going to be the foundation for your future practice scholarship, it needs to be a topic and an issue that you care about.
And the other thing that I'll say especially to the BSN to DNP students, sometimes, faculty members will give like a potential list of some common diagnoses, problems, things like that, because I think when you start out in programs like that, when you're early in the program, it's hard to know exactly what you want to do. But let me tell you something. I mean, if you're, for example, in an F&P program, let's just say you pick the topic of obesity or diabetes or hypertension. Even if the project ends up not being about your most passionate topic, as a future F&P, you will have to know a whole lot about any of those subjects. So there's nothing lost in learning and developing those skills. So I just don't want those students to feel discouraged if they have a topic that is assigned to them by a faculty member, because the faculty usually go through a lot of effort to make sure that we are assigning topics and projects that are timely and relevant and of some value to your future practice. So,
yes.
Well, in summary, the AACN published a white paper in 2015. Please go to their website and check that out. Read it. There's a lot more to it than what we've talked about in this episode, but we hope that we've inspired you to go and talk about it. We are going to look at another element of the paper in the next episode where it talks about the DNP clinical experience. So what are DNP clinicals like compared to other clinicals that we might do in nursing? So that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode.
All right, great. So again, if you're interested, you can learn more about the DNP project through our workbook, the DNP Project Workbook, A Step-by-Step Process for Success. It's available at Springer Publishing. You can check it out, springerpub.com. Again, always follow the guidelines for your specific DNP program. And if you like what you're hearing, check us out on Twitter at DNP Success. On Instagram, DNP Success. You can email us any questions or comments that you have at dnpsuccess@gmail.com. And you can check us out on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, like us, all that great stuff. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next episode.
You've been listening to Dr. Molly Bradshaw and Dr. Tracy Vitale on the DNP Project Podcast. Check out the DNP Project YouTube channel at DNP Success on YouTube.